So, am I coming through? Up until this moment, I'm still debating about what I'm going to say. So, might be kind of incoherent. First thing I want to say is that there's a book by Dosan Yu called Thunderous Silence, which is an overview of the Heart Sutra, and it's wonderful if you're interested in the Heart Sutra or in anything, or the teachings in the Heart Sutra. It's beautifully, beautifully done. And before I came, I went and looked up to see how big it is, so that I could figure out how much to tell you, and it's 267 pages, so get ready. So obviously, I'm not going to be able to tell you all about the Heart Sutra. So I'm going to kind of try and hit some of the highlights of the Heart Sutra. And for those of you who aren't really that familiar with it, tomorrow I'm going to talk about the five aggregates, which are kind of central concept in the Heart Sutra. And I'll try and tell you a little about them today. So the Heart Sutra is actually the Prajnaparamita Heart Sutra. And Prajnaparamita means perfection of wisdom. And what it's referring to is a number of things, but the main thing is that at a certain point in time, I think around zero, CE and BCE, these sutras were written, and they were significant in that they were considered a major change in kind of how we thought about the Buddhist path. It didn't eliminate anything, but it expanded the Buddhist path in a certain way. And so there's many Prajnaparamita sutras. There's one that's 2,000 lines, I think the Diamond Sutra. There's one that's 8,000 lines. There's one that's 25,000 lines. There's one that's 100,000 lines. And then there's the Heart Sutra, which is, I believe, 25 lines. I should probably have counted it. And it's called the Heart Sutra mainly because it's considered to be the core teaching of all these Prajnaparamita sutras. It's also the Heart Sutra because the main speaker in the Heart Sutra is Avalokitesvara, the Bodhisattva of great compassion. And even though this sutra is about the perfection of wisdom, he's the Bodhisattva of compassion. So I don't think he's there by accident. So this sutra is about wisdom, it's about heart. Prajnaparamita means to move to the other side, to cross the river. And that's crossing the river to awakening. So I was thinking, so what is the goal of Buddhism? The goal of Buddhism is awakening. And every Buddhist teaching is about awakening, even though that's kind of hard to define. So what's happened over time is that the teachings about awakening have become more and more direct in an attempt to allow awakening to occur more quickly. So in the Buddha's time, it was said that it might take, eons to be awakened. But as people worked with and struggled with the essential aspects of Buddhism, they came up with more and more paths to try and kind of accelerate the possibility of awakening and awakening in this life. So the second turning of the wheel of Dharma had to do with the notion of emptiness. And emptiness was not a brand new idea, but its elaboration was a powerful new instrument and teaching for understanding the world. So another teaching that came about at this time, and this is kind of the origin of, so the original Buddhism is called Theravadan Buddhism. And around this time, another type of Buddhism kind of began to develop along with Theravadan Buddhism, called Mahayana Buddhism. And so the concept of emptiness was very important in Mahayana Buddhism, and the concept of two truths was very important in Mahayana Buddhism, as well as what all of you probably heard of, the Bodhisattva, the notion of someone who seeks awakening in order to awaken all suffering beings. So in these two truths are conventional truth and ultimate truth. And it isn't one is true and one is false. They're just different perspectives. Conventional truth is the one we all live in. So, you know, a lot of the teachings of the Buddha and the teachings past the Buddha are about conventional truth and how to live in the world, how to be a bodhisattva in the world. And then ultimate truth is what is on the path to awakening. Because awakening is a simultaneous ability to experience ultimate and conventional truth at the same time. So it's not that one gets eliminated or one is true and one is false. They're just different. Now, this is important in the Heart Sutra. That's why I'm bringing it up. So it starts out with the Avalokiteshvara practicing Prajnaparamita. I've yet to find out exactly what it means to be practicing Prajnaparamita, practicing the perfection of wisdom. But he goes on to say that he realized all five aggregates were empty and thus became free from all suffering and distress. So the Buddha's goal was to see the truth of suffering and the end of suffering. Some people think the Buddha's goal was about suffering, but it's the truth of suffering and the end of suffering. And so what is implied here is that by some kind of special type of, I think, questioning meditation, deeply questioning the five aggregates that the Buddha taught, he realized emptiness and he became free of all suffering and distress. So he awakened. So I might not be right about this, but in trying to think about, well, what is this perfection of wisdom practice? It seems like it's a contemplative practice rather than a one-pointed. It may be one-pointed, but it's questioning. It's a type of questioning practice, deeply questioning. And if you know the story of our founder, he became enlightened because he couldn't stop questioning. You know, he spent 26 years questioning. Actually, he may have not spent the whole time because he had to get to a point where he could question, but he was questioning by the time he was 5 years old. Questioning, questioning, questioning. And so that might be a method of meditation practice that we want to cultivate along with all the other types that we practice. Now, tomorrow I'm going to describe how one might meditate on the five aggregates, but today I'll just say the five aggregates are what the Buddha said is where, if we try to think about what is myself, what would we examine? What would we think of as ourselves? Ourselves were form, our body. Sensations, which is feeling tone, and kind of reactions. So feeling tone is that in all experiences, there's either positive, negative, or neutral feeling tone. It's got to have one of those. The third one is perceptions. Perceptions are the way we recognize things in the world, and we recognize things in the world based on memory. So perceptions is very intimately connected with memory. The fourth one is called volitional formations. We refer to as impulses, but that's a really big category. It's all the things that go through our mind, all the ways, all the thinking, all the emotions, all the intentions, all the actions that come from our mind and produce actions in the world, all are in this aggregate. And the last one is consciousness, and that refers to not awareness, but rather to the fact that we have 6 sense organs: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So you might wonder, well, how can the mind be a sense organ? But you can be sensing your thought. You sense your thoughts. So there's some kind of sense perception of your thoughts. Well, the way the Buddha explains it, and goes into great detail even in here, is that in order for any of these types of consciousness to arise, you have to have an object. Take sight, for example. You have to have an object that you see. You have to have an organ of sensation, the eye. And then you have to, and what arises from the combination of the eye and the organ and the brain is a consciousness of seeing. And so without those 3 elements, there is no consciousness of seeing. So consciousness is dependent on circumstance. It's not something that exists without circumstance. Now, that may not be the same as awareness, and so, but that's the consciousness he's referring to. So, you know, and we'll talk about the meditation tomorrow if you're here. So, talking about conventional and ultimate reality, in the first 2 stanzas of the Heart Sutra are from a conventional perspective. And so the Bodhisattva says, form does not differ from emptiness, emptiness does not differ from form. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. The same is true of sensations, perceptions, impulses, and consciousness. You can see why I want to talk about the 5 aggregates. It's mentioned, I think, 4 times, you know, in this sutra. So I was thinking of trying to think about how to describe emptiness, because we think emptiness is a noun. We think emptiness is a something, that you enter emptiness, that you know, it's a realm of existence, emptiness. That's not true. At least that's not what it means. You know, I don't know whether, you know, I can't, when I'm enlightened, I'll be able to tell you really how things work. You know, but for now, I was thinking an analogy to this idea of like form and emptiness is to a flower and aliveness. A flower isn't a flower unless it's alive. I mean, essentially a flower. And aliveness doesn't exist without the flower. So the flower is aliveness, and aliveness is the flower. And so emptiness doesn't exist without the aspects of reality that are said to be empty. It doesn't, there's not some, emptiness isn't space. Emptiness isn't some other thing. Emptiness is a characteristic of things that we don't normally recognize, and recognizing it can lead to liberation, but it's not a place. It's not heaven. It's not, you know, it's not a realm. So at this point in the sutra, things change direction, where from the point of view, from the perspective of emptiness. So it's kind of like from the ultimate perspective, in other words, from the perspective So, oh, the other thing. So Buddhism isn't about what you think. Buddhism is about experience. And on the path to enlightenment is the direct experience of emptiness. The direct experience of reality, that what that emptiness is about, the word emptiness is describing. Now when you have the direct experience, I can't say this from direct experience, from you have the direct experience of emptiness, you realize how reality really is. You begin to understand that things are different than you thought they were. And it's not intellectual. It's a direct experience that I wish I've had. So when you have that, you begin to see how things really work, and that launches you further into the path in a way that everything else before that is a way of preparation for. So when he reaches this point in the sutra, he's talking from the position of the realization of emptiness. And he starts talking about the teachings of the Buddha. And he's saying that once you realize emptiness, once you have this experience, then all these teachings really don't matter anymore. You know, in another Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, there's the analogy to a raft that the Buddha talks about. You take the raft, which is the teachings, across the river, but when you get across the river and you get out and you're awakened, you don't carry the raft around. And so this is kind of what the rest of or a big part of the rest of the sutra is about, is the teachings that the Buddha taught, that if you can directly realize emptiness, then they really don't matter. At the same time, I've often thought that, well, why is all this energy spent talking about all these teachings of the Buddha then? You know, why doesn't he just say, okay, we don't need any teachings, we don't need any previous teachings, everything's empty, well, you know, let's go on. You know, get down to, you know, the Bodhisattva relies on Prajnaparamita. So I think that it must be that the previous teachings are important, and that in a sense, the preparation for the direct perception of emptiness is accelerated if you really have studied the rest of the teachings of the Buddha, or the main teachings, or the main teachings of Sotaesan, of Great Master Sotaesan, that it may be conventionally expressed, but it prepares you to be ready to understand when you do have that direct realization. So he goes over he goes over this perceptual process, you know, that no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, that I was explaining before. He goes over dependent origination. Now in Buddhism, dependent origination is a really important concept that says nothing happens without, all effects have causes, and all causes cause effects. And so nothing exists independently, essentially by itself. But dependent origination itself is a concept. And as a concept, it's only as good as the words that we talk about it in. But emptiness, the direct perception of emptiness, is outside of words and speech. You know, as it says in our Ilwan Song vow, Ilwan's the realm of samadhi beyond words and speech. You know, it's not about thinking, it's not about words. So all the words that the Buddha used to teach us, emptiness, the direct perception of emptiness is beyond that. But they're not a waste of time. I mean, they're helping us see, like dependent origination, that things don't exist by themselves. They depend on other things to exist, and nothing is independent and essential in and of itself. And that's not how we necessarily see things in the world. We see things as each of us is essentially independent, as everything else is independent, you know, And we don't recognize how everything is dependent on another thing to exist. And that's forever. He then goes on to say, and no Four Noble Truths. You know, you don't need the Four Noble Truths if you see emptiness. Well, but I think anybody who studied this sutra when it was written knew about the Four Noble Truths in depth. So it wasn't like, you know, don't study it, but it was like, if you can see emptiness directly, you don't even need to worry about suffering and the end of suffering. It happens. It's part of, you know, no attainments. So in the original teachings, there's this idea of different levels of attainment on the way to enlightenment. You know, kind of like, but again, these are thinking, these are concepts that the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras try to eliminate. Stop thinking about things and see things directly. See how things really are. Then it changes again, because I think that the last part until you get to gone beyond, is again back to conventional reality. It's a description from conventional reality of the benefits of practicing this Heart Sutra. And, you know, the Bodhisattva relies on Prajnaparamita, therefore the mind has no hindrance. And then goes on to say, without any hindrance, no fears exist, free from delusion, one dwells in nirvana. Well, I think hindrances, in this sense, are delusion. Hindrances are ignorance. And so when you have the perfection of wisdom, you have no ignorance anymore. And when you have no ignorance, the effect on you is that no fears exist, which sounds pretty good to me, you know, in terms of living life. Then it goes on to describe that this is, studying and practicing this is really a great thing. If you want to have ultimate enlightenment, which is the supreme enlightenment, Anyatara Samyak Sambodhi, boy, that's pretty good, huh? Which is supreme total enlightenment, and you can practice the, you know, the Heart Sutra. And then he says, and some of the teachers I've read, he says, this is true, not false. Well, that's kind of a funny thing to say when you said that everything is empty. You know, like, this is true, not false. What are you talking about? And some people say it's a joke. You know, that it's kind of like, you know, don't take all this so seriously. You know, it's like, you know, awakening is delightful. It's you know, it's bliss. You know, it's not like, you know, you have to buckle down and, you know, I don't know, maybe it's not, you know. And then there's this mantra, which I've heard some people say is kind of like magic words. And there are cultures throughout the world that believe in magic words, and they're not all primitive cultures. Well, they may have started out, we may think of them as primitive, but they're current. Like the Quran is magic words. You know, it's written, the script it's written in is the script of God, according to Islam. Hebrew is magic words. Similar idea, you know, the script it's written in is the script of God, you know. And then I don't know enough about Asian, but this gate gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisvaha, which we translate, is also magic words. So it's like this idea of, and I guess, you know, when you work with mantras and you focus and focus and focus and try and get rid of thinking, it's kind of like magic words. Because if you can get thoughts slowed down enough that they don't interfere with your perceiving things directly, that's kind of like magic. So, obviously, I love the Heart Sutra. You know, every time I come to talk, I mostly talk about that. Though I also love the Il-Won-Song vow and the truth of Il-Won-Song. And I was going to say, you know, the truth of Il-Won-Song also talks about the two truths, you know, permanence and impermanence. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways to get access to this notion of the two truths. But again, two truths are still one truth. And it's these kind of paradoxes that we can't resolve, but we keep reflecting on that helps reach awakening. So thank you for listening and letting me rattle on about this.
Thank you, WonHyong.